In Harlan County, Kentucky, a region covered in dense oak and hickory forests, local legends were more than just stories told to scare. In the small town of Evarts, a group of friends gathered every night around a campfire, discussing rumors and sinister events that permeated the surroundings. Jack Turner, a fearless and proud young hunter, used to scoff at these stories. "This is all bullshit. Stories to scare children," he said, laughing while adjusting his worn hat. But that night the story was different. One of the friends, Nolan, brought something new. "Have you ever heard of the Faceless hunter?" he asked, his voice low. Silence fell among the group. "He wanders through the forest wearing animal skins, without a face, without a soul. Whoever finds his footprints disappears forever. My uncle swears he saw something last month while deer hunting." Jack laughed loudly, shaking his head. "Your uncle probably saw a bear." "Do you really believe this?" Nolan replied. "Go to the forest then, Jack. Go to Fog Valley. They say that's where he lives." The provocation launched the challenge, and Jack, with his inflamed ego, accepted. "Tomorrow, before dawn, I will hunt in the Valley of Mist. And when you come back, I want to hear you admit that your uncle is just a crazy old man." That night, as Jack prepared his equipment, his mother, Margaret Turner, begged him to reconsider. "Jack, you know the reputation of that place. Even if it's not for legends, it's dangerous. The fogs are treacherous. You can get lost." He smiled to reassure her. "Don't worry, Mum. I'll be back before noon, with enough meat to last the whole month." Margaret watched helplessly as her son disappeared into the darkness. And before we continue with this intriguing story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and leave a like. This helps us bring more content like this to you. Now let's get back to the story. In the heart of the forest, the air was heavy and damp, the sound muffled by the tall trunks. Upon arriving at the Valley of Mist, Jack noticed that the place was even more sinister than he imagined. There were no birds, no insects, just silence. He followed fresh deer tracks, his rifle ready to fire. However, something was wrong. The deer's tracks ended abruptly, giving way to marks that Jack couldn't identify, huge, shapeless, as if a giant predator had passed by. Jack started to feel something, a chill that crept up his spine. "Just the wind," he muttered to himself, trying to shake off the feeling of being watched. As he took a few more steps, he saw something hanging from a branch. It was an animal skin, flayed with frightening precision. When he touched it, he realized it was warm, as if it had been recently removed. That's when he heard it. A low, almost imperceptible sound came from behind him. Not a roar, but something worse, heavy, ragged breathing. He spun around, aiming the rifle, but there was nothing. Just trees and shadows. "Who's there?" he shouted, his voice echoing in the void. Silence was the only answer. Jack tried to remain calm and move forward, but with every step, it seemed like the sound was following him, always keeping an exact distance. Then he saw it. A few meters in front of him, standing among the trees, was the Faceless hunter. Dressed in several skins sewn together, he was a shapeless, grotesque mass of limbs that did not appear human. His face was a void, a smooth surface without eyes, nose, or mouth. Jack froze. The hunter began to move towards him. With slow but inevitable steps, Jack raised the rifle and fired, but the sound of the shot was swallowed by the forest, and the creature continued to advance. Jack started to run, but the paths he knew seemed to have disappeared. The forest had changed, every tree becoming a barrier, every shadow a trap. In the distance he heard a familiar voice. "Jack, come back!" It was his mother. He shouted, "Mother, are you there?" But something was wrong. The voice wasn't hers. It was a grotesque imitation, a distorted echo. Jack ran like never before, but the forest seemed to play with him. The terrain changed every moment. Previously familiar paths became dead ends, and the trees grew thicker and denser, as if trying to trap you. With every step, he heard that irregular breathing, which seemed to come from all directions. The echo of the distorted voice kept calling his name. "Jack, come back. Come home." He knew it wasn't real, but the familiarity was unsettling. After what seemed like hours, Jack spotted an old, dilapidated cabin. Desperate, he ran there, kicking the door that was hanging by a single hinge. The interior was cramped and gloomy. The ground was covered in dry leaves and small bones, like those of rabbits and squirrels. In the corner, there was an unlit fireplace and an old crate that he used to block the door. Jack leaned against the wall, trying to catch his breath. The rifle was clutched tightly in his shaking hands. Outside, he heard slow, heavy footsteps. The faceless hunter's breathing seemed to be getting closer. Suddenly, a dry noise echoed in the cabin. Something scratched the wooden walls. "Go away," Jack shouted, but his voice broke at the end. The scratching stopped, replaced by absolute silence. Jack tried to calm down, but when he went to the window to look out, he saw that something had been left there, stuck on a rusty nail. Another skin, smaller, clearly from an animal he had hunted himself the week before. There was a message engraved on it, as if it had been scratched with claws. "You're next." Jack began to realize that this wasn't random. The faceless hunter was after him for a reason. As he tried to unravel the fragments of his memory, something came to light. The story of his father, Henry Turner, a man obsessed with hunting. Henry was known for his brutality. He didn't hunt just out of necessity, but for the pleasure of killing. He was said to have killed more than 100 animals, some of them just to leave their skins to rot like trophies. Jack always believed that these stories were exaggerated, but now a doubt has arisen. What had his father done to make an entity like the Faceless Hunter come after him? And more importantly, what did it have to do with him? While Jack was lost in thought, the cabin door began to swing. Someone, or something, was pushing her hard. "I'm not going to die here," shouted Jack, grabbing the rifle and preparing to fire. But before he could react, the door was ripped off its hinges, flying into the cabin. At the entrance stood the Faceless Hunter, his presence filling the space with a suffocating aura. Jack fired, but the bullet passed straight through the creature's torso, as if it were made of solid smoke. Desperate, he ran to the back of the cabin, where he found a small exit. Outside, the forest was covered in an even thicker fog. He knew that running away was no longer an option. I needed to face him. Jack stopped in a clearing and shouted, "What do you want from me?" The answer came in an unexpected way. The hunter stopped, raising one of his deformed hands, which seemed to be made of wood and skin. Slowly, he pointed to the floor. Jack looked and saw something that made his blood run cold. They were human footprints, exactly like his, but they went in circles, indicating that he was being hunted by himself. "That doesn't make sense," he shouted, but deep down something clicked. Suddenly he was struck by a vision. His father, Henry Turner, being confronted by the Faceless Hunter years ago. Instead of showing regret, Henry had defied the entity and, in an act of desperation, imprisoned it in an ancient spell, using the blood of innocent animals. Now the Faceless Hunter was free, but he didn't just seek revenge on Henry. He wanted the blood of the Turners. Jack realized there was no way out. He could fight to the death, or do something his father never did, offer a truce. "Take me, but leave my family alone." The creature stopped, tilting its head as if considering the offer. But before anything happened, a sound of gunshots echoed through the forest. Someone was coming. "Jack!" It was Nolan and the other friends who had decided to follow him when they realized he was taking too long. Their presence broke the moment, and the Faceless Hunter turned to the vulnerable group. Jack saw the shapeless shadow of the Faceless Hunter turn towards his friends. The sight was terrifying. Nolan, with a shotgun shaking in his hands, seemed paralyzed before the creature, while the others, less courageous, slowly retreated into the darkness of the forest. "Get out of here!" Jack shouted, desperate. "You shouldn't have come!" But before his friends could react, the Faceless Hunter raised one of his grotesque hands. The shadow around him seemed to come to life, expanding like a thick, unearthly smoke that enveloped Jack's friends. Screams echoed through the forest as Nolan fired blindly, but the sound of his gunfire was muffled by the entity's presence. The darkness swallowed them, and when it dissipated, only Jack remained in the clearing, alone with the hunter. "What did you do with them?" Jack shouted, feeling anger rising in his chest. The creature did not respond with words, but a low, guttural sound, like a growl mixed with laughter, came from the void where its face should have been. Jack began to realize that fighting the creature was futile. He needed to find another way to escape. As the hunter slowly advanced, Jack retreated until he tripped over a raised root. As he fell, he saw something that caught his attention, a mark on the ground, carved into the earth as if it had been made with claws. It was a symbol, something that felt ancient but instinctively familiar. Jack remembered an old book his mother used to keep in the attic. She said it was a gift from her father, full of strange drawings and stories of ancient hunters. He never paid attention, but now he felt that symbol was connected to the creature. Gathering his courage, Jack shouted, "I know what you are. My father did something to you, didn't he?" The creature stopped as if the words had some weight. The silence was interrupted by another echo of the distorted voice that imitated Jack's mother. "He betrayed the pact, and you will pay the price." Jack felt the weight of the truth fall upon him. His father, Henry Turner, not only hunted animals, but made pacts with forces he didn't fully understand. In exchange for luck and hunting success, Henry had promised something valuable, but typical of his greedy nature, he broke the promise. Now the price was being taken, and Jack was the designated victim. He shouted, his voice full of desperation and defiance, "I won't pay for his mistakes!" The hunter stepped forward, his deformed hand rising, and Jack felt a sharp pain in his chest, as if something was being ripped from within him. It was as if the creature was extracting something more than physical, perhaps his courage, his hope, his soul. Before the final blow could be struck, an unexpected sound cut the tension. It was the creaking of branches breaking under hurried footsteps. Margaret Turner, Jack's mother, emerged from the forest, breathless and determined. "Let go of my son," she shouted, holding an old book in her hands, the same one Jack recognized as the book in the attic. The hunter hesitated, his head tilting as if he recognized Margaret. "You were there too," echoed the voice, now sounding more human, but still distorted. Margaret opened the book, turning the pages hurriedly, until she found a spell engraved in archaic writing. "Henry deceived you, but not me. If you want revenge, take it to those who deserve it." The entity stopped, as if pondering Margaret's words. The air around them grew heavier, and the silence of the forest became deafening. Jack crawled to his mother, the pain still pulsing in his chest. "What's going on, Mom? How do you know about this?" She looked at him, her eyes full of guilt. "Jack, your father brought this into our lives. He did terrible things. I tried to protect you, but I never imagined it would come to this." Margaret began to recite the spell from the book, her voice shaking but steady. The hunter roared, his figure becoming increasingly unstable, as if he was made of smoke about to dissipate. "In exchange for my son, take the name Henry Turner. Take his truth wherever you want." The creature stopped completely. Slowly, he lowered the hand that was holding Jack at a distance and turned to Margaret. "The name will be taken, but the debt will never be forgotten." With those words, the hunter began to fade into shadows, which spread across the forest until they disappeared completely. Jack fell to the floor, exhausted, as Margaret hugged him tightly. "He finished?" he asked, his voice weak. She shook her head. "I don't know, Jack, but at least now you're safe." As the sun began to rise, the two left the forest, still scarred by the events of that night. But something still hung in the air, an omen that the story was not completely over. However, they failed to notice the footprints that were beginning to form on the trail behind them, as if a new presence had taken shape. Jack and Margaret emerged from the forest with their bodies exhausted and their minds troubled by the events of the previous night. The air felt lighter in the dawn light, but the weight of the experience still suffocated them. Jack looked at his mother, waiting for answers. "Mum, what was that? How did you know what to do?" Margaret sighed deeply, wiping the sweat from her forehead. "There's a lot I never told you about your father, Jack. Not because I wanted to hide it, but because the truth was too heavy." They walked in silence to the family home, a simple cabin on the edge of the forest. Inside, Margaret opened the old book, the pages of which were filled with symbols that Jack could barely decipher. "That belonged to your father. He believed that the knowledge in him could make him invincible." Margaret's voice became serious, "but all he did was attract something none of us should have crossed." Jack felt his stomach tighten when he heard the words. "And the Faceless Hunter? What is he?" Margaret closed her eyes, as if revisiting painful memories. "He is neither a man nor a spirit. It is a guardian, a force of nature created to protect balance. Your father, Henry, indiscriminately killed not only animals, but people who tried to stop him. He broke the pact, and the hunter was sent to collect." Jack paled. "People? You mean he—" Margaret nodded slowly. "He wasn't the man you remember, Jack. The hunter should have taken him years ago, but I helped him escape. Now I see it was a mistake." While they were talking, something caught Jack's attention. On the window was a pattern of scratches, 4 parallel marks that appeared to have been made by claws. "Mom, was this here before?" he asked, pointing to the glass. Margaret stood up quickly, her face turning pale. "No." The two ran outside and found footprints in the soft earth around the house. They were large, disproportionate, and headed toward the forest before disappearing into the tree line. "He's still here, isn't he?" Jack whispered, his voice full of terror. Margaret picked up the book again, leafing through it in search of something. "I don't know. He may have accepted the bargain, but that doesn't mean he's going to leave you alone." As they examined the markings, an engine noise from the road distracted them. Jack ran to see who it was and was surprised to find Nolan driving the family's old truck. "Nolan!" Jack shouted, relieved, but something was wrong. Nolan exited the vehicle with stumbling steps, his eyes wide and staring. His face was covered in scratches, and he was shaking like a leaf in the wind. He took the others. They screamed, and then there was only silence. Nolan's voice was a broken whisper. Jack helped him into the house, where Margaret sat him down and brought him some water. "Tell me exactly what happened," Margaret said, her voice firm. Nolan trembled as he remembered. "We followed you to the clearing. When we saw that thing, I knew we had made a mistake. After you ran, he surrounded us. The shadows, they came to life. I couldn't save anyone." Nolan held his head, trying to hold back the tears. Jack clenched his fists. "This is my fault. I brought you to this." Margaret cut him off, her voice full of authority. "No, Jack, this started long before you." Margaret found what she was looking for in the book, a ritual that could banish the hunter forever. "It's dangerous, but it might work. We need to return to the clearing where it all began." Jack and Nolan agreed, albeit hesitantly. Margaret took with her the book, an ancient dagger and a bag of herbs that gave off a pungent smell. "Remember, Jack," she said as they walked through the forest, "no matter what happens, you cannot show fear. He feeds on it." When they reached the clearing, the tension was palpable. The fog was so thick that they could barely see a few meters ahead. Margaret began to trace symbols on the floor with the dagger, muttering words that Jack didn't understand. Then the air turned cold. The Faceless Hunter appeared at the edge of the clearing, his figure even more grotesque in the dim evening light. "He won't wait until we're done," Margaret said desperately. The hunter advanced slowly, each step causing the ground to shake. Jack instinctively reached for the rifle, but Margaret grabbed his arm. "No! This will only get worse." Suddenly the hunter stopped and tilted his head at Margaret. "You broke the pact before. Now are you trying to fix it?" The voice was deep, resonating in all directions. Margaret raised the dagger. "You want revenge, don't you? So take me." Jack was in shock. "No! You can't do that!" Margaret didn't back down. "Jack, I've lived my life. You still have yours." The hunter paused, as if considering the offer, and the silence that followed was unbearable. Then he extended one of his deformed hands to Margaret, while Jack screamed in despair, "No!" The faceless hunter extended his deformed hand toward Margaret, his grotesque body moving with the slowness of something that knew time was on its side. The clearing was silent, except for the sound of Jack's heavy breathing as he struggled to contain his panic. "I won't let that happen," Jack shouted, trying to move forward, but Nolan held him tightly. "If you go, everything will be lost," Nolan begged, his face marked by fear and guilt. Margaret turned to Jack, her eyes shining with unwavering determination. "Jack, listen. This is something only I can do. There is no other way to end this." Jack shook his head frantically, tears streaming down his face. "You don't understand, Mother. I already lost you once when Father left us. I won't lose you again." The hunter, now standing a few feet away, tilted his head, watching the conflict with grim patience. Margaret, still holding the dagger, turned to the hunter, beginning to mutter words of an ancient language she had memorized from the book. The ground beneath her feet began to vibrate slightly, and glowing symbols appeared in the circle she had drawn. The hunter took a step back, hesitating for the first time. "You don't destroy me," he said, his voice reverberating. "You only delay the inevitable." Margaret raised the dagger with both hands, pointing it at herself. "Then let it be so." Before she could act, Jack rushed at her, knocking the dagger from her hands. "I won't let you die for something he did," Jack shouted, his eyes fixed on hers. Margaret reached for the dagger again, but Jack gently pushed her back. "Mum, listen to me. I have a plan." He took the dagger, cutting the palm of his hand. Blood began to drip onto the floor, and Jack entered the circle of glowing symbols. "You want revenge, don't you? So take me. I'm Henry Turner's son. I carry the same blood as him." The hunter hesitated, his figure wavering between the shadows. Margaret screamed, her voice full of despair. "Jack, don't do that. You don't understand what he's going to do to you." The hunter slowly approached Jack, as if evaluating the offer. The shadows around him began to intensify, creating indistinct shapes that seemed to echo the faces of animals and people. "Your blood," murmured the creature. "He's the one calling." Jack stood firm, even as he felt the air around him grow heavier, almost unbearable. "Then take what you want from me, but get it over with." Margaret, unable to watch passively, opened the book again, flipping through the pages as tears streamed down her face. "There has to be another way," she muttered to herself. Nolan, who was watching from a distance, picked up the shotgun, although his hands were shaking. "If this goes wrong, I'll at least try," he said, more to himself than anyone else. The hunter raised his misshapen hand, which began to glow with a dark light, something that seemed to suck the very essence out of the air. Before she could touch Jack, Margaret shouted again, "Wait!" She ran to the circle, holding the dagger Jack had dropped. Without hesitation, she cut her own hand, letting the blood drip to the floor and mix with Jack's. "You won't just take him. If you want revenge, take both. But end this now." The hunter stopped, his figure shaking violently. The shadows around him began to dissipate, revealing a humanoid body, fragile and scarred. He tilted his head, as if considering the offer. Then, to everyone's surprise, he took a step back. "The sacrifice is enough." His voice echoed like distant thunder. "But the Turner blood will always attract shadows." With those words, the hunter began to fade into mist, his form dissolving in the growing light of dawn. Before disappearing completely, he took one last look at Jack and Margaret. "Don't break the balance again." When the hunter disappeared, the clearing fell into absolute silence. Jack fell to his knees exhausted as Margaret hugged him tightly. "Were you willing to give your life for me?" she asked, her voice shaking. Jack nodded, his words coming out weak. "You did the same for me." Nolan, observing the moment, slowly approached. "He finished?" he asked, almost in disbelief. Margaret closed the book with a snap, looking out at the empty clearing. For now. When they returned to the house, everyone was exhausted, but something in their expressions had changed. It was as if part of the darkness that hung over them had disappeared. However, that night, Jack had a disturbing dream. He was in the clearing again, but this time he was the hunter. His hands were covered in blood, and he wore a fur mask. When he woke up, in a cold sweat, he looked out the window at the sky. "Is this really over?" he whispered. In the days that followed, Jack, Margaret, and Nolan tried to get their lives back on track. The clearing where everything happened had become a point of absolute silence. No animals, birds, or even the sound of the wind seemed to pass through that place. Although the faceless hunter had disappeared, something in the atmosphere still made everyone uneasy. Jack continued to be haunted by dreams. Every night, he saw himself as the hunter, walking among the trees with the shadows following him. With each dream, he heard the whispers, "The blood calls." At the Turner family home, Margaret never stopped studying the book. Even though he didn't say anything, Jack knew she was still worried. "Did you find something?" he asked one night, entering the room where Margaret was surrounded by candles and notes. She hesitated before answering. "It's not something I wanted you to know, Jack, but I don't think we have a choice." Margaret pointed to a page in the book where there was a symbol similar to the one Jack had seen in the clearing. This symbol is a seal of protection. He can counter the hunter's influence, but requires continual sacrifice. Jack frowned. "Continuous sacrifice? What does this mean?" Margaret looked at him, her eyes full of sadness. "Someone needs to keep the balance. What your father broke still needs an anchor." Jack immediately understood what she meant. "Are you suggesting that one of us should take his role?" Margaret nodded slowly. "Not like him, but like a guardian, someone to make sure the pact isn't broken again." While they were arguing, Nolan ran into the house, panting and covered in sweat. "Jack! Margaret, you need to see this!" They followed Nolan into the clearing. When they arrived, they saw something that chilled their hearts. The bodies of Nolan's friends, missing that night, were hanging from the trees. They were mutilated, but their faces seemed frozen in expressions of absolute terror. "He's back," Nolan whispered, slowly backing away. Jack clenched his fists. "No, he didn't come back. This is a warning." Margaret looked at the symbol on the floor of the clearing, which was now distorted, as if it had been scratched out and erased. "The seal has been broken." Jack made a decision at that moment. "If anyone needs to take on this role, then it's me." Margaret tried to protest. "Jack, no, you don't understand what you're saying. It will consume you." He placed a hand on her shoulder, looking into her eyes. "Mom, you've done enough for me. This started with the Turner blood, and this is how it will end." Before she could say anything else, Jack entered the center of the clearing and began tracing the symbol on the ground with his dagger. "Jack, stop!" shouted Margaret, but he was already mouthing the words from the book. The clearing began to shake, and the hunter's figure appeared again, but this time it did not move forward. He just watched, as if waiting for something. Jack looked at the creature and said, "Do you want balance? So here it is, I accept." The hunter raised his hand, and Jack was enveloped in shadows. He felt his skin burn and his bones seemed to transform. When the shadows dissipated, Jack was no longer there. In the center of the clearing stood a new figure, wearing animal skins, and with a face that was nothing but a blank. Margaret fell to her knees, tears streaming down her face. "Jack!" The figure stared at her for a moment, before disappearing into the forest, along with the original hunter. Back at home, Margaret and Nolan tried to continue living. The surrounding forest grew silent, but never completely peaceful. One night, as Margaret watched the moon through the window, she heard a sound coming from the edge of the forest. When he looked, he saw a figure in the shadows. It was Jack, or what he had become. He didn't come any closer, but he seemed to be watching, protecting. Margaret whispered to herself, "You're still there, my son." And somehow she knew he was. Years passed, and the story of Jack Turner, now known as the Faceless Guardian, who protected the land and punished those who broke the balance of nature, became a living legend among the residents of Harlan, Kentucky. The forest around Mist Valley has gained a new reputation, not only as a dangerous place, but also as sacred territory. Those who dared to invade or disrespect nature came back different, if they came back at all. Margaret Turner, now aged, lived in her simple house, tending a small garden and avoiding the forest that both terrified and comforted her. Every night, she sat on the porch with a lit candle, looking at the shadows that surrounded the edge of the forest. Some curious neighbors asked why she did this. "I'm waiting for my son to come home," she said, with a tired but hopeful smile. The younger ones laughed at his apparent madness, but the older ones understood. They knew that in Harlan, legends were never just stories. As Margaret kept her vigil, the forest of Harlan seemed to be transformed. Animals that were previously scarce returned to inhabit the trees and streams. People began to realize that when they treated the forest with respect, it gave back to them in abundance. More experienced hunters told stories of enormous deer that seemed to watch from a distance, like guardians of the forest itself. But those who dared to violate the natural balance by hunting brutally or leaving trash behind spoke of something very different. A young hunter named Will, known for his arrogance and disregard for local legends, entered the forest with illegal traps. He returned the next morning, staggering, with a pale face and the expression of someone who had seen hell. "He's there, the Faceless one. He watched me the whole time. It didn't do anything, but I knew that if I tried one more time..." Will didn't finish the sentence. He never returned to the forest. As time passed, residents began to consider the Faceless Guardian not only as a threat, but as a protector. They spoke of him with respect, leaving small tributes at the entrance to the forest, branches tied in symbols of protection, fresh fruit, and even drawings made by children. Margaret occasionally saw these tributes while walking along the nearby road. They made her smile. "It's still him, protecting those who deserve it," she murmured to herself. Nolan, who never forgave himself for failing to save his friends that fateful night, also changed his life. He became a fervent supporter of environmental preservation, teaching young people about the importance of respect for nature. One day he visited Margaret with an invitation. "We are organizing a vigil at the entrance to the forest to remember those who were lost and to thank the Guardian. Would you like to join us?" Margaret nodded. That night, dozens of people gathered with torches and lanterns, sharing stories about the forest and the Guardian. Margaret, sitting in a chair near the circle, listened intently, feeling pride in what her son had become, even in his tragic form. When the vigil ended, Margaret was the last to leave. Before leaving, she left a small note attached to a tree at the edge of the forest. "I'm still waiting for you, Jack. I love you forever. Mom." That same night, Margaret had a dream. In the dream, she was standing in the clearing where it all began. But this time, the environment was different. There was no fog or threatening shadows. Moonlight illuminated the space, and the trees seemed to vibrate with life. In the center of the clearing stood Jack, in his human form. He looked younger, like the boy she remembered, with a soft smile on his face. "Did you come to get me, Mom?" he asked. Margaret smiled, tears streaming down her face. "I will always look for you, my son." Jack reached out his hand, but before she could reach him, a shadowy figure emerged from the trees. It was the Faceless Guardian, who looked at her for a moment before disappearing, taking Jack with him. She woke up with her heart racing, but also with a strange feeling of peace. He's still there, but he's not alone. He's still my son in some way. Margaret lived the rest of her days in peace, never giving up hope that one day Jack would return for good. When she passed away, already elderly, the residents of Harlan held a special ceremony in the forest, leaving tributes in her memory. That night, some swore they saw a faceless figure watching from a distance before disappearing into the darkness. Decades later, the legends still circulated. Now, it wasn't just the Faceless Guardian they were talking about, but also a silver-haired woman who walked at his side, protecting the forest. And so, Harlan's forest remained untouched, a place of mystery, balance, and respect. What did you think of this outcome? Leave your opinion in the comments. We love to know what you think. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel and leave a like to support our work. See you in the next video.